Well, good morning, everybody, or I guess good afternoon for most of us. I'm Randy Welsh, the Executive Director for the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance. With me is Dave Cantrell, our Program Chair, who will be assisting me in managing this webinar. We're excited and happy to have with us today Michelle Reilly, who is with the Arthur Carhart National Wilderness Training Center in Missoula, Montana. Michelle works for the Fish and Wildlife. She's an actual Ph.D., has a advanced degree in wildlife management that she got from Northern Arizona University. But in her role at the Carhart Center, she's the Fish and Wildlife representative working on wilderness training for the four interagency or for the four land management agencies who have the Carhart Center in place. And so she's actively involved in sharing messages about wilderness management with the agency community. We're excited to have her here today. She's going to provide us an interesting look at an alternate history of wilderness, one you might not have heard about or seen, about the women who were involved in wilderness management. We often think of wilderness, or a lot of white guys get described as being the originators of wilderness, but I can truthfully tell you there were a lot of women behind the scenes, in the front scenes, engaged in helping to share the message about what wilderness values were and wilderness, importance of wilderness. And so Michelle today is going to share some of those stories with us and provide a deeper, more in-depth understanding about the people who were involved in establishing the wilderness movement within the United States. So Michelle, welcome again from NWSA. Thank you for being here today, and we'll go ahead and let you take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you, Randy and Dave at NWSA for giving me this opportunity to talk to you all. I really appreciate that. And this, just welcome everyone to this Wilderness History webinar. Thanks for joining today. I also wanted to thank Ann Schwaller. She's a Forest Service employee that I had the pleasure of working with a few years ago, and she inspired a lot of this work. So I want to thank her for that. The content for what I'll be discussing today comes from an article that I wrote for the spring issue of the International Journal of Wilderness. And at the end of this session, this presentation, I'll put the link to that article in the chat box. Okay, so a little bit about me. Randy did give me a nice introduction there. I work for the Fish and Wildlife Service as the representative at the Arthur Carhart National Wilderness Training Center. And I've been in that position for a little over 3 years. Prior to that, I worked at an ecological services office for the Fish and Wildlife Service for about 1.5 years. So I'm relatively new to the service. Before my federal career, I studied the impacts of non-motorized recreation on mammals in Northern California. And then after that, I had a brief stint as a visiting professor at a university in New Mexico. So I live in Missoula, Montana. I enjoy being outside, backpacking, and being on the river, and just enjoying the perfect Montana summers. There are 2 screens that I'm going to ask you to participate, either animating or writing and annotating or drawing if you prefer. So I just wanted to give you a quick tutorial. Like I said, it's only 2 spots, so I'm not going to be upset if this doesn't work. But if you put your mouse up towards the top of your screen, if you're on a laptop, usually the Zoom toolbar appears. And in that toolbar, there's something that says annotate, which you can see there circled in yellow on the screen. And if you click on that, you open a tray, and it has these different options. And here is a text tool. Beside it, you can also draw or use stamps to express yourself if you'd like to participate. But those are there. Again, it's only 2 places, so not a lot of pressure. One thing is if you make a mistake, use this erase tool circled on the screen there. Please do not use the clear tool because you'll clear your work, but also everyone else's annotations. So if you make a mistake, just use the erase tool. Yeah, so that is that as far as logistics. And now we're gonna go ahead and get started. So I don't think I have to convince anyone here in this webinar that wilderness is an amazing gift. It provides us with innumerable benefits, and I can't thank our wilderness predecessors enough for their foresight and their commitment to the protection of our natural lands. And the wilderness story has been told many times, and we all know the key figures. We've heard stories and retold stories about what I call the big three. So the wilderness heroes that are credited time and time again. On the right, or on the left, we have Howard Heiser. He was the executive president of the Wilderness Society and the primary author of the Wilderness Act. Top right, Bob Marshall, a Forest Service employee, co-founder and financier of the Wilderness Society. And then the bottom, Aldo Leopold. He was an author, also a Forest Service employee, and also co-founder of the Wilderness Society. So these are the stories that we usually hear. But the stories don't have to be about just those three men because the stories are much more diverse. And I'm here today to remind you of those stories or perhaps introduce you to the stories. And so we're gonna test the annotation tool right now. If anyone recognizes any of these women in this collage, if you want to use your text tool and you can give them a little name tag, and we'll see if we can name a few of these ladies. I'll give you maybe it'll take 30 seconds to try to do this. And I can see it's working because there's a couple names up there already. So again, if you can't find your annotation tool, sometimes you just have to hover your mouse up near the top of your screen, and then you should see some taskbar pop up, and you can use, click on annotate and then text tool. So do a couple more seconds here. And I cannot see the chat box. So Dave, I think if you want to monitor the chat box and just let me know if I need to address anything, that'd be great. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to clear this. I'm going to attempt to clear it maybe. Let me see if I can do this. All right, so thank you for that. I think the text tools are working. So that collage is from the journal article. And at the end of the article, the names and the credits of all these women that were in that collage, you can find that there if you're interested in learning about any of those women. Okay, so here we are in present day, and I invite you to think of a future where Ruth Bader Ginsburg isn't mentioned for her contribution to gender discrimination, or without mention of Greta Thunberg when hearing about environmental activism. And our wilderness history is rich with female contributions, which should be acknowledged just as regularly as the stories with their male counterparts. And in 1961, John F. Kennedy established the Commission on the Status of Women, and he appointed Eleanor Roosevelt as the chairwoman. And we're just going to listen to a very short clip. The clip is, I believe, 90 seconds long, so it's very short, and there's no video, it's only audio. And this is from a televised 1962 discussion between Roosevelt and Kennedy. So I'm going to go ahead and play this. And Dave, if the sound isn't coming in well, just let me know, okay? So let me see if I can get this to play.
Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt's interview with the president on the status of women, April 18th, 1962.
Mr. President. I would like to thank you for being on this program. Thank you, Mr. President. Now, I would like to ask you, because I have always been interested in women's affairs, and I was very much honored when you made me chairman of your new committee on the status of women. Perhaps you'd be willing to tell the people what prompted you to name this committee at this time and what you feel is the real need for it.
Well, we are attempting to make sure that the women, for example, who work, 1/3 of our working force are women. We want to try to encourage every company in the United States and certainly stimulate governmental leadership in providing equal pay and equal conditions for women. 22 states do it now. We can do a much better job on that. We want to make sure that the available talent which we have in this country in trained women is being used effectively. I think we want to make sure that some recognition is given to the special problems women have as the mother and the housewife, and at the same time their desires to participate usefully in public and private life. This is a matter of great national concern, and I think that in this great society of ours, we want to be sure that women are used as effectively as they can to provide a better life for our people, in addition to meeting their primary responsibility, which is in the home.
Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt.
Okay, so did you catch the very last statement? He said, we want to make sure that women are used as effectively as they can, in addition to meeting their primary responsibilities, which is in the home. And I'm not highlighting this in any way to shame anyone. Times were different, norms were different. I recognize that. But I want to share to provide some context to the stories that I'm telling today. Again, it's not about shaming or blaming anyone. It's important for information and context. So if you could use your annotation tool again, and you could use the text tool or the draw or stamp tool, but could you just on the slide here, what are your thoughts or your feelings upon hearing that? I'll give you maybe 20 seconds. We just get some comments on the board. All right, maybe people are feeling a little shy today, so let's not belabor this. I'm just going to, times have changed, yep. Okay, well, I'm gonna go ahead and expected from that time. Oh, now people are writing, I'm sorry, I'll give it a second here. It makes a little sad, but times were different, yep. I didn't realize our primary responsibility was in the home. Good comment. Okay. Okay, thank you for your participation. I'm going to go ahead and clear that. Sounded like contemporary right up until the end. Okay, yep, times have changed. Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and advance my slide. So if you still want to comment on that, you go ahead and write it in the chat box. Was correct for that period of time. Okay, all right, I'm going to go ahead and clear that. Thank you, everyone. So yeah, times are different. Cultural norms have changed over the past decades. And again, I just want to illustrate how culture relegated roles at this period in history, and what common attitudes were held in our recent past. And with this knowledge, it gives us a place to move forward from. So that being the prevalent viewpoint at the time, it's no wonder then that the important work of the work and the stories about females are not as well known or recognized in our wilderness history. So perhaps the contributions of these women, those contributions and those stories were easy to lose record of because they weren't seen as the typical participants in these roles. So let's learn some of those stories now. Probably the most well-known of the women I'll talk about today is Marty Murray. She's often referred to as the matriarch of the wilderness movement, or the grandmother of the conservation movement. So Marty was a field biologist, a teacher, and an author. And in her book, Two in the Far North, which was originally published in 1962, she advocated for wilderness protection in Alaska. And the picture on the cover of this book, this is Marty and her husband Olaus, and it was taken when they had just returned from their honeymoon. So in 1956, Marty, Olaus, and some other field biologists traveled to the upper Senjak River on the southern slope of the Brooks Range, on the south slope of the Brooks Range, and inside what is now the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And their mission was to garner support and gain protection for an entire ecological system. And that was, as to be known, the Arctic National Wildlife Range. And so I just want to highlight that again, that they were interested in protecting an entire ecological system. And that was not a common approach to conservation at this time. So it was really impressive thinking. They, the couple recruited former US Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas to help persuade President Eisenhower to consider their campaign. And President Eisenhower established the range in 1960 and set aside more than 8 million acres for the, quote, unique wildlife, wilderness, and recreational values. And her devotion to wilderness is apparent in her testimony to Congress in 1977 for the Alaska Lands Act. And I'll read that to you now. I am testifying as an emotional woman. And I would like to ask you, gentlemen, what's wrong with emotion? Beauty is a resource in and of itself. Alaska must be allowed to be Alaska. That is her greatest economy. I hope the United States of America is not so rich that she can afford to let these wildernesses pass by, or not so poor she cannot afford to keep them. So after her husband Olaus's death in 1963, Marty continued to fight for wilderness preservation. She wrote letters, articles, and spoke at hearings. And she was very active and pushed for the Alaska National Interest Conservation Lands Act, which passed in 1980, giving protection to 104 million acres as various conservation lands, and it also included increasing the size of the refuge by 10 million acres. Oh, did I skip a slide? My apologies. Oh, no. So Marty's contribution to conservation and preservation in Alaska helped protect some of the last remaining large tracts of wilderness in the country. And Marty was awarded the Audubon Medal, one of the highest honors in conservation, in 1980. She received the Sierra Club John Muir Award in 1983. And in 1998, President Clinton awarded Marty the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian award. She worked for more than 70 years to protect wild spaces. In October of 2003, Marty died in her cabin in Moose, Wyoming at the age of 101. And upon her death, LA Times staff writer wrote, Marty Murray served as her husband's secretary, hostess, and cook, as well as forthright adjunct in his preservation activities. And with a life as grand as hers, with the contributions to wilderness and her contributions to the United States, I would hope that Marty can be remembered as the inspirational leader that she was, and for her dedication to both wilderness and conservation, and not to be remembered only as her husband's secretary, hostess, and cook. Next is a really amazing story about Polly Dyer. She's seen here in the far right. Polly's story is an unfortunate example of how inaccurate historical narratives can undermine the contributions of women through history. And I'm not suggesting that the inaccurate narratives were intentionally repeated in some devious manner. It's just sometimes the full story isn't known. And then over time, what is known becomes the story. And it's important to tell historical stories accurately. So in 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson created the North Cascades National Park, which is Washington's third national park at that time. And central to this long campaign for the North Cascades was Polly Dyer. In the mid-1950s, Polly Dyer met Howard Zahn Heiser, the executive secretary of the Wilderness Society at the time, when they both fought to stop the construction of the Echo Park Dam and Dinosaur National Monument. And years later, during a visit to Polly's home in Seattle, Howard heard her use the word untrammeled in her campaign to protect stretches of coastline near Olympic National Park. And stories differ as to whether she recommended the word in his drafts of the Wilderness Bill, but it was her enthusiastic use of the word that perhaps inspired or swayed Howard to adopt this word as the primary descriptor of wilderness. So I'm going to backtrack just a little bit. In 1958, Polly organized a hike to protest a proposed road in the ocean strip of Olympic National Park. And the hike drew many notable figures of the time, including William O. Douglas, Howard Sennheiser, Harvey Broom, and Marty Murray, among others. And so the hike lasted 3 days and it covered more than 20 miles. And it was really a key moment in the environmental movement in the Northwest. And so if this works, I just wanted to play a short clip for you. It may or may not play.
This was a hike to remember. You might say our whole nation was involved, for something was at stake that concerns you and me and our children, and the children of our children. You might say, too, that it began in our nation's capital.
Okay, so that clip just exemplifies, or it further explains how important that hike was. And Polly was one of the people to organize all logistics and aspects and publicizing that hike. So the list of accomplishments and awards attributed to Polly is extensive. When asked what distinguished her from other environmentalists, Peter Jackson of North Cascades Institute answered humility. She had grace and presence. She was perfectly happy to let others take credit. And so when I was researching Polly for this article, I often wondered if the lack of credit for the word untrammeled or any of her other work could be attributed to her humility. Helen Bensky was described as a housewife who lived on the edge of the swamp, but she played a prominent role in galvanizing citizen support and became an early leader of the Great Swamp Campaign. And so in 1959, the Port Authority of New Jersey and New York announced a plan to fill in the Great Swamp in New Jersey to develop a new multi-million-dollar airport, which was slated to be the world's largest international jetport. The Great Swamp Basin was home to 39 species of mammals, nesting site for 244 bird species. And the Great Swamp Committee used this data to formulate a proposal that the area be designated as a national wildlife refuge in hopes of ending that jetport proposal. And on a second visit to a Fish and Wildlife Service regional office, the first being an unsuccessful visit, the second visit, Helen secured a promise from the regional director that if the Great Swamp Committee could purchase 3,000 acres, he would open an office there and assign a manager. But purchasing thousands of acres was not easy. The area had hundreds of woodlots dating back to the 1700s for which they needed the guaranteed titles before the Fish and Wildlife Service would proceed. So with the help of some local elites, the committee raised $5 million to purchase the titles to 2,600 acres of land. And on May 29th, 1964, the Secretary of the Interior oversaw the dedication of the refuge. But unfortunately, the Port Authority had not lost interest. And so Helen, upon reading the words of the Wilderness Act in a newspaper article, she knew that wilderness designation was really the only way to permanently save Great Swamp. So Helen led a successful campaign, and Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge Wilderness was one of the last pieces of legislation that President Johnson signed before he left office. And Abigail Fair of the Association of New Jersey Environmental Commission said about Helen, people have got to tip their hats to her for saving this area. Without her energy and her intelligence, I think we would be the fourth metropolitan jetport. And then fellow activist David Moore from the New Jersey Conservation Foundation said, no one had taken on the Port Authority, and certainly no one had taken them on and won, but Helen did. And when asked about her work for Great Swamp, she stated, there were a lot of people who contributed to the campaign. And she also said, our story is not remarkable nor unusual at all. So again, just another story with an incredibly humble hero. And so the final featured woman in this webinar is Sarah James. So on the coastal plains of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, there is a place referred to as the sacred place where all life begins by the Gwich'in of Alaska. The Gwich'in live south of the Brooks Range, and they live strategically located along the porcupine caribou herds migration path. The coastal plains serves as a birthing and nursery ground for the herd, and the herd is also deeply intertwined with the Gwich'in way of life. So legislation to protect the Arctic refuge coastal plain as wilderness has been introduced into almost every Congress starting in 1986. And the coastal plain is described as the most biologically productive part of the Arctic refuge for wildlife, and is the center of wildlife activity. Sarah James is native Nitsai Gwich'in and has championed protection of the coastal plains for decades. In 1988, Gwich'in leaders from across Alaska and Canada developed a resolution to formalize their opposition to energy development in the refuge and for their support of wilderness designation of the coastal plain. And Sarah was asked to serve as one of the 8 representatives that would take this to the political arena. And Sarah has traveled nationally and internationally to give speeches and testimonies about the importance of the caribou herd. In 2002, Sarah was awarded the Goldman Environmental Prize for her grassroots environmental activism with the Gwich'in. And in 2015, the Wilderness Society awarded Sarah their Robert Marshall Award, the highest honor for her conservation and land ethic work. And then the Ford Foundation awarded Sarah a fellowship as one of their emerging leaders and a changing world. After 50 years of advocacy, Sarah continues to speak for the caribou, the refuge, and wilderness using positive messaging and compassion. Sarah has led the campaign against exploration in the sacred place where life begins. And thanks to her, the issue has gained nationwide attention. And she continues to campaign for wilderness designation. So these are but a few of the stories that emphasize the contribution of women environmentalists and conservationists to our wilderness history. There are many others, and what I wanted to leave you with are these stories, and this knowledge. These women are talented and passionate pioneers, and their stories should be told so that they continue to inspire other women who fight for wilderness. Okay, that is all I have for you today. I can put the links for the article in the chat box.
That would be a great idea, Michelle. I think that would give people an opportunity to go get more detailed information, especially if you've got that list of women that were involved in wilderness stewardship, wilderness designation efforts throughout the years. To allow some individual research, that would be great.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and open the chat line to any questions that you might have for Michelle. Please go ahead and just type it into the chat line. And I think there's we've got few enough people that we can even have you raise your hand and be called upon to ask your question online. So if you have a question, either type it into the chat or go ahead and raise your hand. We'll call on you. You can just ask Michelle directly. So, of course, this doesn't go very good if nobody has any questions. I think
I'll ask a question.
Go ahead.
I just wondered, Michelle, how you chose these particular women to highlight on today's webinar. Or have you done stories on all of the ones that we saw listed at the end?
Thank you for the question. No, when I first was doing this presentation, I limited it to 30 minutes. So in the article, Celia Hunter and Jenny Woodhill are also in the article. But I have not written up a formal article for those other women that were shown scrolling at the end of the presentation.
Can you talk a little bit about your research, like how you went about compiling these somewhat hidden stories and who you might have talked to that were, particularly useful?
And
Yeah,
Michelle, while you do that, if you would care to relate any particular story that gives you particular inspiration, or any individual that really gives you that inspiration as well.
Yes, thank you. The inspiration for this story came when I first started at the Carhart Center, and I was just trying to educate myself and learn as much as I could about wilderness. And at the time, Ann Schwaller, who works for the Forest Service, Boundary Waters, she had been detailing at the Carhart Center, and I started talking to her, asking her questions. And she really inspired me to dig deeper and to learn more about these women. She had worked at, I think, one of the Wilderness Stewardship Alliance's annual meetings. There was a session about diversity and diverse groups and recreation. And so she had a lot of information, a lot of resources, and again, was the inspiration for me doing my own research and digging into this. As far as researching the stories, I did a lot of research with the historian at the Fish and Wildlife Service. He sent me a lot of valuable information and places to continue my personal research. So yeah, looking through archives from different congressional records to archives of different nonprofit organizations. Yeah, talking to other people in the agencies that had met any of these women, knew any of these women. You know, some of them passed away, maybe, you know, less than a couple decades ago. So there are still people that had met these women, and getting that personal account was valuable for my research.
All right, we've had a couple of other comments in the chat that are good. Susan Oste talked about the 11 women who were on a display that she did for the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act. Susan, if you've got a link to a picture of your display, that would be great. We'd love to share it. And Kim Waits also mentions that they did a campaign in Alabama several years ago that recognized the women that fought for the Sipsey Wilderness, and there's a link there.
Nice.
For a story about the women who were involved in the Sipsey designation.
Thank you. I'll look into both of those. I appreciate that. There are a lot more stories that I wanted to include in the article, but of course there is a page limit that I was allowed. So as far as choosing the women, I just tried to pick ones that there was a link to Wilderness that I could follow, and so that's how I chose those ones. Sorry, there's another message. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to ignore. Thanks, Kim. Yeah, that's great. Oh, the display boards have disappeared over the years. Oh, that's too bad. Maybe you have pictures. My favorite woman to research, man, they were also interesting. Some of them, it was a little more difficult because there wasn't as much information out there, and so those, you know, Polly Dyer had quite a bit of information. Sarah James, that I never could reach someone that had personally interacted with her. To me, they were all great stories, so I don't know if I could pick one that was my favorite, but I did like the difficulty in tracking down the information.
Yeah. I personally think that the story of Alice on Heiser is an important one that hasn't been told enough. She was, you know, there behind the scenes helping to support Howard during the many years that he worked for the Wilderness Society. And what's not known is that Alice often would accompany Howard on summer pack trips into the wilderness areas, and while she was there supporting him, taking care of the family. You know, she was also one of his proofreaders and editors for a lot of his drafts of important legislation and speeches as well. So she was definitely right there in the midst of things.
Yeah, Jenny Hill Wood, who was a longtime friend of Celia, she was very interesting. They were both interesting to research. There's quite a bit of information, but their lives were pretty inspiring. The way they were pilots and then started Camp Denali. I think that those are great stories as well.
So Brecklin is asked, what was the most surprising thing that you found through your research, both good and bad?
Oh, the most surprising thing. I don't know. That's a good question. I did not know Marty Murray had won the Presidential Medal of Freedom, or yeah. And so that was really surprising to me in a good way. Tracking down photos that are allowed to be published was very difficult because I didn't have funding to write this article. And so a lot of the photos that were already published couldn't be used unless, you have to pay several $100s to use them in another publication. And so finding any pictures of Polly Dyer that could be used was very difficult.
Nancy Roper has asked a question that is one I wish I had asked. How can we more widely distribute these stories beyond the wilderness community?
That's a great question, Nancy. I think one way to get the stories out is doing presentations like this. Hopefully the recording will be available and more people will be able to view it. And I'm not sure International Journal of Wilderness's time period after which non-subscribers can read articles, but I think when that point in time is met, sending the articles out to different organizations. But I don't know. Does anyone else have ideas how to get the stories out? The Carhart Center, we're making these types of presentations and stories a more regular part of our trainings. And so that's another thing that we're doing to get the stories out.
All right. Well, are there any other questions that people might have for Michelle while we have her here? Well, seeing no questions, I'm just going to head and say thank you, Michelle, for a wonderful presentation, for helping us to continue to get the message out. Oh, we've got some hands that have been raised. So Mara Woolard, would you go ahead and ask your question?
Sorry, it was just a clapping.
Oh, okay, clapping. Is that the same with you, Breck?
Yeah, I think people are clapping and giving thumbs up.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and again say thank you, Michelle, for the very interesting presentation. A reminder that our next NWSA webinar will be in April, and I believe I've got Jeff Marion lined up to talk some more about sustainable camping practices and research that he and his cohort have been doing about successful backcountry campsite management. So look for us for that in April. And with that, you'll also be expecting a coffee hour. I'll be putting on a NWSA funding programs coffee hour where any of you can ask questions about our two funding programs, the Trail National Forest System Trail Stewardship Trail Partner Funding Program and the Wilderness Stewardship Performance funding program that we have for our partner groups. Both of those are currently soliciting project proposals through April 15th, and I'm about to advertise a coffee hour for that near the end of the month, where if you have questions or want to get more details about that, we can make that available to you. So with those things in mind, I'll go ahead and close off the recording. Want to